the knockaway. And buckle up for Latrell Sprewell.
Was there any doubt in your mind?
Spree for the rest of the season.
Latrell Sprewell once helped carry an 8th-seeded Knicks team to the NBA Finals. But his road to rock bottom had already begun. He was one of the best two-way guards in the whole NBA. He could score, he could defend. He could do both at once, night after night. Fans in Golden State watched him grow into a 4-time All-Star. Then came a moment that changed everything. Sprewell put his hands around his coach's neck, and the league never let him forget it. That single act became the headline of his career, sitting next to a famous quote about feeding his family. Most fans only know those two stories, but the real story runs deeper. And as we trace how one choice led to the next, use the hype feature and give this video some hype so more fans can find the story. Sprewell still made choices that hurt him again and again. His anger got the better of him. His pride pushed him into fights he could not win. He ignored warning signs when his career started to fade. This is the story of a gifted player who had almost everything and slowly lost it, piece by piece, through his own hands as much as anyone else's. To understand how far he fell, we have to go back to where he started. A raw young guard from a small college who nobody expected to become a star. Latrell Sprewell arrived in the NBA with the Golden State Warriors, and it did not take long for people to notice him. In his first season, he averaged over 15 points a game. He played heavy minutes and shot with real confidence for a rookie. The league gave him a spot on the all-rookie second team. That was just the beginning. In his second season, Sprewell exploded. He jumped to nearly 21 points a game and almost 5 assists a game. He played over 40 minutes a night, which is a brutal workload for any player. That kind of performance earned him a spot on the All-NBA first team and the All-Defensive second team in the same year. Very few guards in the league could match that mix of scoring and defense. Sprewell was not just a scorer. He was a complete player, someone who could guard the other team's best man and still put up big numbers on offense. His peak came in the 1996-97 season. He averaged over 24 points a game and more than 6 assists a game. He was logging almost 42 minutes a night, carrying a heavy load for a struggling franchise. That season earned him his 4th All-Star selection. By any measure, Sprewell was one of the top guards in basketball. His salary had grown along with his game, and he was being paid millions of dollars a year to be one of the faces of the Warriors. What is easy to miss is how different Sprewell seemed to the people who coached him early in his career. Away from the bright lights of the NBA, people who worked closely with him described someone quiet, respectful, and easy to teach. That private reputation did not match the angry, dangerous image that later took over the public conversation. The gap between those two versions of Sprewell matters, because it shows that the man the world thinks it knows may not be the whole picture. But while Sprewell's game kept rising, the team around him kept falling apart. Golden State struggled to build a winning roster, and the losses piled up. Then the team brought in a new head coach named P.J. Carlesimo. Carlesimo had a reputation for being loud and hard on his players. He had clashed with players before, during an earlier coaching job. When he arrived in Golden State, the results on the court got worse before they got better. The team started the season with a brutal record of 1 win and 13 losses. That kind of start puts enormous pressure on everyone in the building, from the players to the coaches to the front office. Carlesimo's demanding style did not fit well with a locker room that was already tense and losing. Players on a struggling team are often on edge already, worried about their futures, frustrated by losses that keep piling up, and less patient with a coach who pushes hard without results to show for it. Add a new coach still trying to establish his authority, and the entire environment becomes a lot more combustible than fans watching from home would ever guess. All of that pressure was building toward a moment that would define Sprewell's career forever, and it was about to explode on the practice floor. Think about what all of that meant. A rookie who arrived with modest expectations turned himself, within just a few seasons, into one of the most feared two-way guards in the entire league. He did it through hard work, through long hours in the gym, and through a level of competitive drive that coaches and teammates noticed even before the wider public caught on. That kind of rise does not happen by accident. It takes discipline, focus, and a willingness to learn from criticism, the very traits that would later get buried under a very different public image. Sprewell had built himself into one of the most complete players in the league. He had all-star nods, all NBA honors, and a max-level game. He had everything to lose, and on a single December afternoon, at a routine practice that should have been forgettable, all of that began to unravel. It happened on December 1st, 1997, at the Warriors' practice facility in Oakland. This was not a game. It was an ordinary team practice. The kind that happens hundreds of times every season without anyone outside the building ever hearing about it. But this practice would become one of the most talked about moments in NBA history. Coach Carlesimo was pushing the team hard that day. He turned his attention to Sprewell and criticized the way he was passing the ball. He told Sprewell to put a little mustard on his passes, meaning to throw them with more force and sharpness on its own. That kind of comment might sound harmless, just a coach pushing a player to try harder. But teammate Bimbo Coles later said he believed Carlesimo's criticism that day was meant to embarrass Sprewell in front of the whole team. Coaches sometimes push players hard to test them. Other times, the pushing crosses a line to public humiliation. Coles believed this was the second kind of moment. Sprewell had reached his limit. He told Carlesimo to keep his distance. "Don't come up on me," he warned. Those words should have been a clear signal to back away and let tempers cool. Instead, Carlesimo moved closer to Sprewell rather than stepping back. What happened next was serious no matter how you look at it. Sprewell grabbed his coach by the throat. This is the moment most people picture when they hear Sprewell's name, and it deserves to be treated with the weight it carries. A player putting his hands on a coach's neck is a serious act of workplace violence. No amount of provocation fully excuses physically attacking another person at work. That much is not in question. Whatever Carlesimo said, and however close he stood, nothing forced Sprewell's hands onto his coach's throat. That choice belonged to Sprewell alone, and it is the single most important fact in this entire story. What is in question is exactly how dangerous that contact was. Sprewell later said that Carlesimo could still breathe during the struggle. He said the marks that showed up on the coach's neck were scratches from fingernails, not signs that he had been choking off Carlesimo's airway. By most accounts, the whole physical struggle lasted somewhere around 7 to 10 seconds. Short, sudden, and frightening, but not the drawn-out strangling attempt that some early reports suggested. None of that changes the basic fact that Sprewell crossed a line that should never be crossed. It does change how severe the specific danger really was, compared to how it was first described to the public. After the initial struggle, players and coaches separated the two men. Sprewell left the practice floor. He went to the locker room, showered, and changed into street clothes, the normal routine after a workout ends. At that point, many people would assume the incident was over. Sprewell had walked away. He had time to cool down. He had every chance to simply go home and let the team handle the fallout through normal channels. Instead, Sprewell made another choice that would cost him. Around 20 minutes later, he returned to the practice floor. He later said he came back to vent his frustration with words, not to start another physical fight, but the situation quickly spun out of control again. There was a glancing contact with Carlesimo's cheek during the chaos. Sprewell's defense argued this was not a second-planned punch. Instead, he testified that people were physically restraining him, grabbing his arms, and that the contact happened while he was trying to swing free of that grip, not while he was trying to hit anyone on purpose. Whatever the exact nature of that second contact, the decision to walk back into the same tense room while still angry, while the situation was still raw, was Sprewell's decision alone. Nobody forced him to return. He had already shown once that his anger could turn physical. Choosing to go back into that environment before fully cooling down gave the league and the media even more ammunition to use against him. That choice, more than almost anything else in the story, shows how Sprewell's own judgment worked against his own interests. There is one more detail from that day that rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. During the cooling-off period, Bimbo Coles wanted to go into the locker room. Coles was a respected veteran, someone Sprewell trusted, and he might have been able to calm his teammate down before the situation escalated a second time. Warriors staff blocked Coles from entering. Sprewell's defense later argued that this decision removed the one person in the building who had a real chance of preventing the second confrontation. We cannot know for certain what would have happened if Coles had been allowed inside. What we do know is that an opportunity to defuse the situation was taken away right before things got worse. It is worth pausing on just how fast this all happened. In the span of less than half an hour, a routine practice turned into a physical altercation, a cooling-off period, and then a second confrontation that sealed Sprewell's fate in the public eye. Anyone watching from outside the building only ever heard the outcome, not the sequence. They heard Sprewell attacked his coach twice, without hearing about the walk to the locker room, the shower, the change of clothes, or the 20 minutes that passed in between. That missing context did not make Sprewell innocent. It did change how deliberate and calculated his actions actually looked, compared to how they were described in the first wave of coverage. By the end of that afternoon, Sprewell had grabbed his head coach by the throat, left the floor, and then returned to a tense and unresolved situation instead of staying away and letting things cool down on their own. The Warriors and the NBA were about to respond with punishment far beyond anything the league had handed out before, and Sprewell's entire career was suddenly hanging in the balance. The response from the Warriors and the NBA was immediate and severe. On December 3, 1997, just 2 days after the incident, the Golden State Warriors voided the remaining 3 years of Sprewell's contract. That contract was worth $32 million across 4 years, and it was fully guaranteed money. The team pointed to language in his contract about conduct, moral turpitude, and standards of good citizenship, arguing that Sprewell had violated the basic trust required to keep his deal in place. The very next day, NBA Commissioner David Stern added a punishment of his own. Stern handed down a 1-year suspension, the longest non-drug suspension in league history up to that point. Between the voided contract and the year-long ban, Sprewell was facing the possible end of his career and the loss of millions of dollars in guaranteed pay, all from a single day at practice. The players' union stepped in to challenge both punishments. This case went to arbitration, a formal legal process where an independent judge reviews the facts and decides whether the punishment was fair under the league's labor agreement. The arbitrator chosen for this case was John Feerick, the dean of Fordham University Law School. Feerick had a reputation for being extremely fair, so respected among labor lawyers that some called him John the Just. Feerick's rulings did not fully side with Sprewell, and they did not fully side with the league either. On the question of the contract, Feerick ruled against the Warriors. He said the team did not have just cause to cancel the deal because the team's punishment and the league's punishment were addressing the same underlying conduct. In plain language, the arbitrator said the Warriors could not erase a guaranteed contract on top of whatever punishment the league handed down. That decision restored Sprewell's contract and protected $16.3 million in salary that the team had tried to take away. On the question of whether the team and the league could both punish Sprewell for the same incident, Feerick sided with the league. He ruled that nothing in the labor agreement stopped both the team and the commissioner from disciplining a player for the same act. That part of the ruling was actually a loss for Sprewell and the players' union, and it set a lasting precedent that still shapes how players can be punished today. On the length of the suspension, Feerick again pushed back against the league. Commissioner Stern had wanted a full year-long suspension, insisting the confrontation was premeditated, meaning planned out ahead of time rather than a sudden loss of control. The arbitrator said the attack was not planned ahead of time. Feerick reduced the suspension by 5 months, down to 68 games, ending on July 1, 1998. That reduction saved Sprewell several million dollars in lost salary and shortened the time he was kept away from the game. This ruling mattered for reasons that reached far beyond Sprewell himself. It showed that even in the face of enormous public anger, a team could not simply tear up a guaranteed contract because fans and commentators wanted blood. Guaranteed money in professional sports contracts had real legal protection, and Sprewell's case helped prove it, a fact that mattered to every player in the league, not just to Sprewell himself. At the same time, the ruling made clear that Sprewell's own conduct, while not premeditated, was still serious enough to justify one of the harshest suspensions in league history. Both things were true at once. He was punished fairly for something serious. He was also treated by much of the public as something worse than what the legal record actually showed. It is a rare thing for a labor case in professional sports to produce such a mixed verdict, one that punished the player harshly while also protecting him from a punishment that went even further than the law allowed. That balance rarely made it into the highlight reels or the talk show arguments, where a simple story of a violent player was much easier to repeat than a nuanced legal ruling about contract law and workplace discipline. That gap between the legal findings and the public imagination only grew wider once the media got fully involved. Commentators across the sports world used the incident to talk about much bigger, more sweeping ideas. According to the research behind this story, some of the loudest media voices used Sprewell's actions to claim there was a wider problem of violence and disrespect spreading through the entire NBA. Radio host Rush Limbaugh went further than most, tying the incident to hip-hop culture and comparing NBA players to street gangs. That is a massive leap from one player's specific, serious mistake to an entire culture and race of people. Compare that reaction to another sideline incident from roughly the same era. NFL linebacker Kevin Green physically attacked his own coach during a live broadcast. That event was largely treated as a heated, competitive outburst, the kind of thing that happens in the emotional world of professional sports. It did not spark the same national conversation about violence, morality, or the character of an entire league. Around the same period, according to the research, an NHL incident where two white players racially taunted one of the league's few black players received far less attention than it deserved. The contrast is hard to ignore. A black player choking his coach became a symbol of a supposed crisis. A white player attacking his coach on national television became a forgettable moment. A racist incident against a black player barely registered in the national conversation at all. Not everyone reacted to Sprewell's actions the same way. Younger black fans in particular often saw the moment through a different lens. That did not mean they thought choking a coach was acceptable. It meant many of them recognized a player who had been repeatedly disrespected and pushed by an authority figure, and who finally reacted, even if that reaction was wrong. The Athletic brand and one leaned into that same complicated sympathy. The company built an advertising campaign around Sprewell, including a commercial called American Dream, which showed him getting his hair braided while talking about hard work and identity. That commercial connected with fans who saw his return to the court as a story of resilience and self-determination, not just scandal. None of this erases what Sprewell did. He still put his hands on his coach's throat. He still returned to a tense situation instead of staying away. But the media's decision to turn one player's mistake into a symbol of an entire league's moral decline, and to treat similar incidents involving white athletes so differently, shows that the coverage was not simply a neutral report of the facts. It was shaped by ideas about race that had nothing to do with what actually happened at that practice. When commentators reach past the specific facts of an incident to make sweeping claims about culture, community, or character, they are no longer simply reporting the news. They are building a narrative. And once that narrative takes hold, it tends to stick around long after the facts that supposedly proved it have been challenged or overturned. The label that stuck to Sprewell after all of this was uncoachable renegade, a player supposedly too volatile and dangerous to manage. Reporters dug up earlier incidents to support that label. In 1995, Sprewell had fought with teammate Jerome Kersey, and reports said he later returned to the gym carrying a piece of lumber. In 1993, he had clashed physically with teammate Byron Houston, a much bigger and more physical player who outweighed him by around 50 pounds. On the surface, these stories seemed to prove that Sprewell had always been a walking problem waiting to happen. But locker room conflicts like these were far more common in the physical culture of 1990s NBA practices than most fans realized. Plenty of players clashed physically behind closed doors without it ever reaching the public or triggering serious punishment. Most of those moments simply stayed inside the team. The people who actually coached Sprewell up close tell a different story than the uncoachable label suggests. Gene Bess, his coach at Three Rivers Community College, said he was genuinely shocked when he heard about the Carlesimo incident. Bess remembered Sprewell as one of the most coachable and respectful players he had ever trained. He said Sprewell learned quickly, stayed quiet, and never showed a temper when corrected. That is not a description of a player built for conflict. That is a description of a student who wanted to get better. Jeff Van Gundy, who later coached Sprewell with the New York Knicks, offered a similar picture. Van Gundy remembered seeing Sprewell quietly shooting baskets with his young child at the team's practice facility. He described him as patient and gentle in that private moment. Nothing like the angry public image that had followed him for years. Van Gundy believed Sprewell was simply a real person, someone who refused to build a fake, polished image just to win public approval or land more endorsement deals. That refusal to perform for the cameras may have made him easier to dislike from a distance, even as the people closest to him respected him. Two coaches, from two very different points in his life, describing the same quiet, coachable, respectful young man, is not a coincidence. It suggests that the uncoachable renegade label was less a description of who Sprewell actually was, and more a shorthand the media reached for because it was simple, and it fit the story they had already decided to tell. After his suspension ended, Sprewell was traded to the New York Knicks, and that trade gave him a genuine chance to rebuild his career and his image. The results were remarkable. During the 1998-99 season, Sprewell became a key piece of a Knicks team that entered the playoffs as the 8th seed, the lowest possible seed in the bracket. Almost nobody expected that team to go anywhere. Instead, they rode a hot streak all the way to the NBA Finals. one of the most surprising playoff runs in league history. Sprewell was a major part of that surprising success, showing that he could still perform under enormous pressure on one of basketball's biggest stages. The following season, in 1999 to 2000, Sprewell signed a 5-year contract extension worth $62 million. That is not the contract a team gives to a player they consider a lost cause. It is the contract a team gives to a proven star they plan to build around for years to come. The Knicks front office had every reason to be cautious after everything that happened in Oakland, yet they chose to invest in Sprewell for the long term. A strong signal about how much value they saw in both his game and his character. Once they worked with him directly, his run in New York challenged the entire premise that he could never accept coaching or thrive within a winning team structure. Still, it is worth being honest about what that comeback did and did not prove. It proved Sprewell's career could survive one disaster. It proved he still had elite talent and the mental toughness to perform in high-pressure moments. What it did not prove was that his judgment away from the court had fundamentally changed. The warning signs from Oakland had not disappeared. They were simply quiet for a while, waiting for the next moment of pressure to test him again. That next test arrived before the 2002-03 season, when Sprewell showed up to Knicks training camp with a fractured hand. His explanation was that he had slipped and fallen aboard his 70-foot yacht, which he had named Milwaukee's Best. The Knicks organization did not fully believe that story. They fined him $250,000 for failing to report the injury quickly, a massive penalty that signaled real distrust between the team and its star player. Soon after, New York Post reporter Mark Berman published a very different account of how the injury happened. According to the Post, a guest on the yacht had vomited on the carpet. Sprewell had grown angry, swung at that guest, missed, and hit a wall instead, breaking his hand in the process. Sprewell strongly denied this version of events and filed a libel lawsuit against Berman and the newspaper, arguing that the story was false and had seriously damaged his reputation. That lawsuit was eventually dismissed, and much of the sports media treated the dismissal as proof that the Post's version of the story was true. But that is not actually what the court ruling established. New York has a strong reporter shield law that protects journalists' ability to use confidential sources without revealing their identities. Because Sprewell was a public figure, he faced a very high legal bar called actual malice, meaning he would have had to prove the reporter knowingly published false information or showed reckless disregard for the truth. The court sided with the Post mainly because the articles were framed as allegations from confidential sources and included Sprewell's own denials, not because a judge or jury ever determined which version of the yacht story was actually true. In other words, the lawsuit's dismissal was about how the story was legally protected, not about proving what really happened that night. But by the time the legal details faded from public memory, the suspicion around Sprewell had already hardened into something most fans simply accepted as fact. This is a case where the machinery of the legal system built to protect honest journalism ended up protecting an unverified story simply because it was reported carefully enough to survive a lawsuit. That is a very different thing from proving the story was true, even though most people who followed the case never learned the difference. The final chapter of Sprewell's NBA career began on October 31, 2004, and it may be the single most misunderstood moment of his entire story. The Minnesota Timberwolves offered him a 3-year contract extension worth $21 million. Sprewell turned it down. His full explanation as recorded at the time was this. He asked why he would want to help the team win a title when they were not doing anything for him, said he had a lot at risk, and said he had his family to feed. The public seized on that last line and turned it into a punchline. The image of a millionaire athlete complaining about grocery money. Clips of that quote circulated for years, almost always without the surrounding sentences that gave it any context at all, turning a business decision into a punchline that followed him for the rest of his life. What got lost in the mockery was the actual strategy behind that decision. Sprewell's agent Bob Gist believed that accepting a deal worth $7 million a year, a steep drop from the $14.6 million Sprewell was earning that season, would send a damaging signal to the rest of the league about his client's declining value. Gist's plan was to reject the extension, let Sprewell play out the final year of his existing deal, and then wait for a contending team to get desperate as the February trade deadline approached. The hope was that a team chasing a championship would offer at least a mid-level contract worth around $5 million or more to add an experienced scorer for a playoff push. Gist made it clear publicly that Sprewell would not sign for the league minimum salary, saying his client would not stoop or kneel to accept that kind of deal. This was not a spontaneous outburst of greed. It was a calculated gamble built on the idea that Sprewell's name still carried enough weight to force a bidding war. The problem was that the gamble required everything to go right, and nothing did. Sprewell's performance collapsed during that final season in Minnesota. Whether from the media circus, the pressure of playing out a contract dispute in public, or simple age catching up with him, his production fell off a cliff, turning into the worst statistical season of his entire career. The trade deadline came and went without the offer. Gist had been counting on the market for a 35-year-old guard, with a well-publicized pay dispute and a fading stat line simply evaporated. Gist never adjusted the plan as the market kept shrinking, and Sprewell never adjusted his expectations either. Sprewell never played another game in the NBA. One quote about feeding his family became the epitaph for his entire career. But the real failure sat underneath that quote. It was a negotiation built on pride and an outdated sense of his own market value, run by an agent and a player who refused to bend even as every signal around them said the plan was falling apart. That refusal to adjust more than any single sentence is what actually ended his career. There's a hard lesson in how this played out. A strategy built around pride and past value can work when the market cooperates, but it can also collapse completely when a player's performance drops at exactly the wrong moment. Sprewell and his agent bet everything on the idea that his name alone would attract a desperate contender. When his own play fell off during the very season he needed to prove his worth, that bet had almost no chance of paying off. The years after basketball brought a financial collapse that unfolded in painful public detail. In 2007, federal marshals seized Sprewell's yacht, the same Milwaukee's best that had caused him so much trouble years earlier, after the holding company connected to the boat defaulted on a $1.3 million mortgage. The yacht itself was valued at $1.5 million. That same year, the state of Wisconsin placed a tax lien on Sprewell worth roughly $3 million, tied to unpaid state income taxes and penalties that had piled up. The following year, in 2008, Sprewell's Milwaukee residence, valued at $405,000, entered foreclosure after he missed 5 straight monthly mortgage payments of $2,593 each. In 2009, his River Hills mansion, worth roughly $1.15 million, went through its own foreclosure process and was repossessed. His estate in Purchase, New York, valued at $2.3 million, was eventually foreclosed on by Deutsche Bank and later sold in 2017 for around $1.5 million, a noticeable step down from its original value. Alongside these financial losses came a deeply painful personal lawsuit. In 2007, Candace Cabell, the mother of 4 of Sprewell's children, filed a $200 million civil lawsuit against him in federal court in Manhattan. Cabell alleged that Sprewell had broken an oral agreement between them, that he had physically abused her, and that he had suddenly cut off financial support for her and their children. According to the allegations in that lawsuit, Sprewell entered their home in September 2006 and told her their relationship needed to end, then stopped covering household and child support costs. These were allegations made in a civil case, not facts proven in a criminal trial, and they should be understood that way. But the lawsuit itself, regardless of its outcome, added another painful layer to a life that was already unraveling financially. A $200 million claim is enormous by any measure, and even as an unproven allegation, it became part of the public record surrounding Sprewell's post-career years, arriving at almost the exact same time as the yacht seizure and the tax lien, making an already difficult period even harder. Taken together, the picture is stark. A massive fortune, built over more than a decade of NBA salaries, was worn down within just a few years by the combination of lost income, heavy debts, unpaid taxes, expensive properties, and serious personal obligations. Sprewell's story shows how quickly financial security can disappear once the paychecks stop, especially for someone who had built a lifestyle around the assumption that they would keep coming. A yacht, several large homes, and major tax obligations all require steady income to maintain. Once that income disappeared, following a career that ended earlier and more abruptly than anyone expected, the debts and obligations did not disappear along with it. They simply kept accumulating, one missed payment and one unpaid bill at a time, until the losses became impossible to ignore. So where does that leave the real story of Latrell Sprewell? He committed a serious assault against his coach, an act that deserved real punishment, and nothing in this video should be read as excusing that. At the same time, the arbitrator who reviewed the case rejected the idea that his actions were planned out in advance. The attempt to erase his guaranteed contract did not survive legal review. The yacht fight that so many people accept as fact was never actually proven in court. His decision to turn down the Minnesota extension had real strategy behind it, even if that strategy failed completely. None of that erases Sprewell's responsibility for what happened. His anger and his pride kept putting him in positions that made his life harder, not easier. He chose to return to a tense practice floor instead of walking away. He and his representation refused to adjust to a changing market, even as every warning sign pointed the other way. Those choices belonged to him, and they came with real consequences that followed him for years. But talent that real does not simply disappear from the record, no matter how a career ends. Sprewell helped carry an 8th-seeded Knicks team all the way to the NBA Finals, a run that still stands as one of the most surprising stories in league history. He showed again and again that he could respond to coaching and perform when the pressure was highest, whatever the doubters said about him. Years later, New York welcomed him back. He has returned to Madison Square Garden as a Knicks ambassador and as an analyst for MSG Networks, sharing his knowledge of the game with a new generation of fans. Coaches like Jeff Van Gundy and fans who watched him up close in New York remembered a fuller, more human person than the caricature the rest of the country settled on. His story is a reminder that a single afternoon and a single sentence can define how the world remembers someone, even when the full record tells a far more complicated tale. Sprewell was not the simple villain that headlines made him out to be, and he was not an innocent victim of unfair coverage either. He was a hugely talented player whose temper, pride, and stubborn refusal to bend cost him more than he ever needed to lose. For all the damage he caused to his own story, Latrell Sprewell still showed that even a broken legacy can find a place back home.